Private member's business, notice number 7. Motion to be moved by the member for McMahon, Assyrian people.
And I call the member for McMahon.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I move the motion on the Assyrian people as circulated on the notice paper. Mr Deputy Speaker, this House has heard before about the plight of the world's Assyrian people, the plight that has had generations of violence, of oppression and indeed of attempted genocide. This situation worsened following the fall of Saddam Hussein. I remember celebrating with our local Assyrian people after the fall of Hussein because it was felt that brighter days might be ahead. But alas, that was not to be the case. There were, it is estimated, 1 million Christians in Iraq in the year 2000. There are now 150,000. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, that oppression and violence which has lasted for generations continues. Beyond 2003 to 2010, at the massacre at the Our Lady of Deliverance Church, which was a terrible, terrible event. And there have been ongoing attempts by the Assyrian diaspora around the world to get attention for the plight of the Assyrian people and to get a homeland for the Assyrian people in Iraq. And again, we celebrated in 2016 when the Iraqi government agreed in principle to a homeland for the Assyrian people. But alas, it has not yet occurred. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, I want to today bring particular attention to the House to the plight of those Assyrians in northwest Iraq who have fled ISIS-inspired violence in the past and are now being subject to bombings by Turkey in relation to the dispute between Turkey and the PKK. Those Assyrians who live in the Dohuk province and in villages like Zakko and Bersiveh, these are people who have been driven out of other towns and cities in Iraq, particularly around 2014 with the rise of ISIS. The Arabic letter Noon was put on the homes and the doors of the homes of Assyrian people, and they were told to convert or face murder, and they had to flee. And accordingly, they fled to villages where they are now being bombed. And regardless of the rights or wrongs of the dispute between Turkey and the PKK, it is not the fault of the Assyrian people. And this motion calls on the Turkish government to cease the indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas because it is the Assyrian people who are paying the price in that dispute. And this motion does call for that to occur, and it is urgent that it does occur. For too long, the Assyrian people have been a footnote, been not thought of in disputes in the Middle East, whether internal in Iraq or between countries in the Middle East. And that must come to an end. The Assyrian people, the indigenous people of Iraq, the people who have given the world so much, deserve better. In the brief time remaining, Mr Deputy Speaker, I do want to touch on a few other elements. I want to take this opportunity, I think it's appropriate in the House, to pay tribute to the patriarch of the Assyrian Church of the East, Mar Gevorgis III. He's been the patriarch since 2015. He's a much-loved figure by Assyrians around the world, including in Australia. I met him on his first visit to Australia as patriarch. I met him more recently when he came to Australia to consecrate Mar Benjamin, the Bishop of Melbourne, and Mar Awarham, the Bishop of Western Europe. He is a good friend of Australia and a wonderful leader of Assyrians around the world. I was particularly honoured and pleased to meet him on my visit to Iraq in Erbil and to have lunch with him, as was my advisor Ninos Aaron, and to talk about the plight of Assyrians in Iraq. I paid tribute to him because he has announced, rather unusually for a patriarch, his retirement from the office due to ill health. And the election of a new patriarch will occur later in the year, and we look forward to welcoming that new patriarch after their election to Australia, I have no doubt, fairly early in the patriarch's reign. I also want to take this opportunity of paying tribute to Assyrian leaders in Australia, particularly Hermes Shahen and David, who lead the Assyrian National Council. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, they join us in the chamber today, together with other leaders of the Australian Assyrian community. It does not matter what the organisation is called and what letters go into the organisation. What matters is what's in their heart. And what's in their heart is leadership of the Assyrian people. And I welcome them and thank them for their generations of leadership of the Assyrian people. Mr Deputy Speaker, I want to thank also the member for Fowler, who will second this motion, and his long-standing commitment to the Assyrian people in his time in this House, which will, as he's announced, soon come to an end. But I know the Assyrian people will want me to thank him for his leadership, and I also thank in advance those honourable members opposite for what I expect to be their support, and thank them in advance very genuinely for their support of the Assyrian people as well.
And I thank the member for McMahon. Is the motion seconded?
I second the motion.
And do you reserve your right, or would you like to speak now?
I'd love to speak now. I thank my colleague, the member for McMahon, for moving this motion, and I welcome all our Assyrian colleagues here today. The simple fact is, in my electorate and in the electorate McMahon, Assyrian and Chaldean families have long since made their home. Since the 1980s, they've been coming to Australia in greater numbers under various humanitarian, refugee and family reunion visas. The Australian Assyrian community has made a significant contribution to our nation, and that's because they're some of the most hard-working, industrious, dedicated people to migrate to this great country of ours. Despite migrating to Australia, this vibrant Assyrian community has not forgotten where they came from, their homeland, and particularly the struggles of their people. Now, the Assyrian community of Iraq, as we've just heard, has shown great strength and resilience in the face of extraordinary tyranny and adversity. I commend the Australian Assyrian community for their campaigning and tireless efforts in support of the Assyrian people facing such a terrible plight in the Middle East. I take the opportunity of acknowledging Hon Chris and David and all our members of the Assyrian National Council-Australia. And I also want to particularly refer to Ms Carmen Lazar of the Assyrian Resource Centre for the ongoing advocacy, but the extraordinary role that they play every day for the Assyrian community settling in this country. It was only last week that David and Hermes met with, together with Carmen, met with the Minister for Immigration to discuss the ongoing and pressing issues facing the Assyrian people of Iraq. During the meeting, they raised the possibility of Australia playing even a bigger role in the settlement of Assyrians and other religious minorities from Iraq in this country. I know this approach is particularly supported by His Beatitude, Archbishop Malazaya, as well as His Grace, the Archbishop Nuna of the Chaldean Catholic Church. My community in Western Sydney has played a very constructive and welcoming role in settling refugees to this country, particularly with the majority of refugees coming from the Middle East now calling our region home. I must acknowledge the great work of Carmen Lazar and the Assyrian Resource Centre and thank her for her extraordinary efforts and assistance in settling migrants and refugees from the Middle East. Over the last decade, we've seen the Assyrian people being forced to abandon their region in Iraq, where their culture and their traditions has flourished for over 6,000 years. Many of the Assyrians have been forced to flee their homes in cities and now into remote villages, where unfortunately there's limited access to health, education and other essential services. These families are living in very harsh conditions now, with little resources available and certainly no hope of returning to their homes. Now, the recent attacks on the Assyrian villages in Iraq, which have threatened the lives of many and left places of religious and cultural significance in ruins, demonstrates that the actual survival of the Assyrian culture and their identity is clearly under threat. The situation is so dire that there are reports that the Assyrians of Iraq have declined a staggering 90% over the last decade. So an estimated 1.5 million in 2003, now it's just over 150,000. We can only pray that those remaining in Iraq do get the opportunity for a new start at life, free from the threat of persecution and free to practice their religion and cultural identity. The ongoing political turmoil in Iraq leaves me with great fear for the plight of the Assyrians and the religious minorities living there. While the threat of ISIS may have been removed, unfortunately the Assyrians, the Christians and other religious minorities continue to live in fear and increasing threat from various militias controlling local areas, particularly throughout the Nineveh plain. We hear reports of curfews being imposed upon them, as well as harassment and abuse. Like many, I welcomed the statement by the Iraqi government in 2016 to recognise the aspirations of the indigenous Assyrians, leading to an in-principle agreement to establish an autonomous region. I call on the Iraqi government to give effect to that decision of 2016 and provide a safe haven for Assyrian people. We cannot abandon the people who our civilisation owes so much.
Order. The question is the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And Deputy Speaker, I'd like to begin by thanking the member for McMahon for moving this motion, respectfully, as far as I'm aware, there is not a very large Assyrian population. In fact, I suspect there's virtually no Assyrian population in the federal electorate of Goldstein. But I stand here supporting this motion from a position of principle. Principle that all people have a place on this earth and have a right to the basic tenets of freedom and security to be able to go out and live those lives. So a position based on principle that if you wish to have a society that's cohesive and sustainable, then decentralisation of governance and control and self-determination is critical for all people. But on principle, to make sure that we understand that it does not matter who you are or the basis of your ethnic, social, religious, sexual orientation, gender identity. Everybody has a place in this world, everybody has a right to be treated with decency and respect, and everybody has a right for a place to call home. And that's the basis in which I support this motion, because the spirit of it is quite clear that the Assyrian people living particularly in Iraq who've experienced discrimination and violence deserve a place in which they can call home and be safe and secure in their lives. And the reality is that has not been recent history. And as a consequence, you found people who felt persecuted and discriminated against simply on the basis of who they are, both because of their heritage, but more critically because of their religious belief. And there is no place for that in this world, and as far as I'm sure you also share that view, Deputy Speaker, certainly no place for it in this country, but when you are the custodians of a lived heritage extending for thousands of years, and as was marked before, for 6,000 years, it isn't just a custodianship of a heritage and a culture which the people who are the custodians wish to keep alive. It's that we as a common people and humanity should wish to keep alive, because survival of culture, of traditions, of history rests so much in the continued living of culture and particularly around languages. And when a people are isolated or separated from their country or their land, and don't have the capacity to be able to peacefully coexist, that language and that tradition, that culture progressively diminishes. And that makes humanity worse off, not just the custodians who lose their identity and their sense of cultural significance. As Deputy Speaker, this comes from a position of principle, of course, as well as you know of my Armenian heritage and some of the tragedies that have befallen upon them as a minority group in some communities, and the consequences that have befallen them throughout history because of the isolation or discrimination and persecution of them because of their history and their tradition. Of course, representing the third largest Jewish community in Australia in the Goldstein electorate, there is another community that knows very well the lived experience of when people are treated and used and abused and persecuted because of their religion, their ethnic heritage and their identity. It goes to the heart of a speech I gave in this parliament only last week, where, extending on the recent speech by the Prime Minister to the United Israel Appeal, who talks specifically about the horrors of identity politics, it's when we cease to see people through their common humanity and start to identify them through their identity, and that can be used both to bolster or to persecute, that we lose sight of what brings us together as a people. And of course, it's our common humanity that builds the bridge between those of us who sometimes we have differences in our history and our traditions towards a more perfect humanity for all. But that starts with acknowledging and understanding people's basic rights to be able to live out their lives, that sense of commonality and equality between all people regardless of their background, their right to be able to have safety and security, to be free to exercise their conscience as they see fit, and of course to manifest that consistent with respect for the rights and freedoms of others. And when those are violated, those principles are violated, it isn't just those who are the victims of it, individuality. It's a violence that's perpetuated on all of us, because that's the basis in which there's a validation of harm that can be done to any person simply because of who they are, their background and their right to exist. And that's why we must always stand up on these important issues and stand up for a common sense of humanity, and of course particularly for the Assyrian people, the Christian minorities in Iraq. That is why we stand with them today.
Order. The question is the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Adelaide.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And Deputy Speaker, I too rise to speak and support this motion, and I thank the member for McMahon for raising such an important issue, an issue that we should speak out on, and I acknowledge his commitment and the vibrant, diverse community that he represents, which is very similar to my seat of Adelaide. Deputy Speaker, I'd also like to welcome the Assyrian leaders and community from around Australia that are here today. Deputy Speaker, can I just say what happens around the world directly affects us and our communities here in Australia. And this is why advocating for peaceful resolutions in other countries is also good for us here in Australia. And this is precisely the purpose of this motion. Deputy Speaker, Syrians in Iraq are an ethnic and linguistic minority group. They're the indigenous people to the Upper Mesopotamia. Most of the world's 2 to 4 million Assyrians live around their traditional homeland, which comprises parts of northern Iraq, Syria, Turkey and Iran. Now, Deputy Speaker, according to a report by the Centre for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University, and I quote, "The Assyrian people have been repeatedly victimised by genocidal assaults over the past century. Massacres, plundering, cultural desecrations and forced deportations were all an endemic." Now, around 750,000 Assyrians died during this genocide, amounting to nearly 3/4 of its pre-war population. The rest were dispersed elsewhere around the Middle East and all around the world, Deputy Speaker. And when we think of the Middle East and the conflicts that take place and have taken place over the last few years, you have to remember that the Christian minorities in the Middle East are one of the oldest Christians ongoing since the birth of Christ, one of the oldest Christian religions in the world. And that population has been diminished gradually, slowly and systematically. So, Deputy Speaker, today I join the members on both sides of the House on calling on the Turkish government to immediately cease its military campaign in civilian areas of northern Iraq, which has resulted in the evacuation and displacement of dozens of Assyrian villages and the displacement of thousands of Assyrians, Deputy Speaker. This is something that has gone on for too long and must stop. And as I said today, it's estimated that over 60,000 Assyrians have settled here in Australia, maybe more. And I know that our Australians of Assyrian descent are desperate, as all of us are, to see peace for their people. Everyone has the right to live in peace. Everyone has the right to live in peace and to live in harmony. And we must speak out for the fundamental human rights of all people, including these minorities such as the Assyrian Christians. And that includes their freedom to practice their linguistic, cultural and religious traditions. And this is why I too call for a protected enclave, as we have heard, in the Nineveh plain for the Assyrian people. And as we heard the members previously, this could take a number of forms, including an independent state or autonomous region of a city-state. However, it must guarantee a safe haven and stop the annihilation of the Assyrian people. Deputy Speaker, governments of all persuasions here in Australia must speak out on human rights violations. And today we need our government here as well to speak out for the Assyrian people and other persecuted minorities. Deputy Speaker, I can also go on and talk about our aid budget, which has shrunk, which has been assisting people in the Middle East. And I think Australia's aid budget has shrunk under this current government. In 1995, Australia was ranked 9th in the OECD countries. In 2020, we're ranked 21st. So more aid is needed to assist these people. Deputy Speaker, we have a moral obligation to help countries and to help people around the world. And people such as the Assyrian people in those areas who have suffered immensely so much, wars, destruction, the displacement of people, things that are unacceptable today for a modern world. We need to stop this, we need to speak out, and we need to ensure that these people have the same rights as everyone else to practice their religion, their linguistic language and their culture, and to live in peace.
Order. The question is the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Monash.
As I thank the member for McMahon for bringing this motion forward and those members who have supported this motion. The 60,000 Assyrian Christians have been pulled into the bosom of this nation. Mesopotamian history goes back thousands of years. So does this country go back thousands of years. And we have a heritage where we know there are paintings some 60,000 years old in this country. And when we travel the Middle East, of course, you also have an enormously long history. So you've come into the bosom of a country that has a long history. We accept that the Assyrians here in this country are making a great contribution, not only making a great contribution, but also leaders throughout our communities, which we appreciate very much. And this nation loves its multicultural being. And what also this motion recognises is the oppression of Christians around the world, and especially in the Middle East in this particular case. Having never been dispossessed, living in this country of freedom and freedom of movement, freedom of religion, our values that are sometimes tested, our relationship with one another, the respect we have for one another is sometimes tested, and we live in a world that has not been suffered the dispossession and the attacks that this community has suffered in Iraq. And I just want to recognise that today, that I don't come from a place where I'm standing in your shoes, because I can't. That would be my heart. I come from a place where I've grown up in this country and only observed and heard and cared what was happening to my fellow Christians around the world, and especially in Iraq. But you have stood the test of time. You still exist today. And thus there are still generations today, of the hundreds of generations, but you are just a part. We need to send the message to those we can, and Australia does have reasonable influence. We're not without influence. And you're a part of that influence. You as a community, and I'm talking about the Assyrian Australians, I'm not saying Australian Assyrians, very important. Australians with an Assyrian heritage, which is extremely important to the families within the Assyrian community, because you are all connected back to your homeland, even though you're in the bosom of this great Southland. So what we're really saying to you as members of Parliament is we actually care what is happening. And the member for McMahon didn't bring this to the table in this green part of the Parliament for no good reason. He brought it to the table because there's an issue here that we recognise as a nation that needs to be addressed. And when you're in pain, we're in pain. When you're suffering, we're recognising that. Because if a part of our community is suffering, that means we're all suffering. And you are very much a part of the Australian community. And I talked about taking you into the heart of the Australian, in the bosom of this nation. So, Deputy Speaker, I am honoured to have these few moments to address this issue, support the member for McMahon, and to say to Christians around the world, we're on your side. You stand with the authority of your Maker, and we stand with you.
Thank the member. The question is that the motion be agreed to. There being no further speakers, the debate is adjourned and the resumption of the debate will be made in order of the next sitting.